When I spoke at Imagine No Religion 7 in Toronto this summer, I had the opportunity to meet a gentleman who had a unique, I say relatively unique, certainly in the church, a unique perspective on the soul. His name is Dr. Julien Musolino. He is a cognitive scientist. He holds a dual appointment in the psychology department and the Center for Cognitive Science at Rutgers. He's author of a book called The Soul Fallacy, which dissects the soul beyond science. Hey, wait a minute. You can measure or approach the soul scientifically? This is interesting stuff. So I wanted to have a conversation with Dr. Julien Musolino, and he joins me now. It's great to have you, sir. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to chat with you this morning.
So, very quickly, we need to define the soul. I was just curious. I looked up Merriam-Webster, the most basic definition of a soul. The immaterial essence, animating principle, or actuating cause of an individual life. The spiritual principle embodied in human beings, all rational and spiritual beings, or the universe. We're getting more nebulous as we proceed here. And then the third definition I'd seen in the top three was a person's total self.
Right.
How do you define the soul?
So that's a great question. So I think there are two tracks here. One is a historical one. Notions of souls have been around for millennia, and they've been discussed and refined and written about. So that's by scholars going back to Plato and Aristotle, all the way through Descartes and even further down. And then there's what people, lay people who do not necessarily read Descartes, read Aristotle, actually believe. Through a mix of exposure to religion, their own intuitions. So the first step in the book was to try to get a sense of what it is that people believe. And you'll see that, and so you basically ask, you do empirical research, you ask certain questions, and you try to find out. And you'll see that when you do that, we get something that incorporates some of the elements that you just mentioned. So I've done this with students at my university, for example. These are educated people, right? They're taking classes in psychology. And I ask them a number of questions. And what comes back is that most of them believe in a soul, and they believe in a soul that has three key properties. The first one, and this is something you mentioned when you read the various definitions, is they'll tell you that their soul is somehow immaterial or non-physical. So it's different, separate, distinct from the body. That's one big property. The second one, they don't put it this way, but that's what I call psychologically potent. So if you ask them, what does your soul do for you? They'll tell you things like, well, it gives me my consciousness, free will, my personality, my ability to make decisions, sometimes even my ability to fall in love. So these are psychological faculties, psychological capacities, right? So the soul does something for people that is psychological in nature. So it's psychologically potent. And the third key property is that most people think that it's immortal, right? So when your physical body dies and ceases to function, the soul is supposed to carry your consciousness into the afterlife. So it turns out that that's the soul that most people believe in. Is that the only way to define the soul? Of course not. There are tons of ways to define the soul. Some are metaphorical, some are slightly different, but that's the one that seems to capture the imagination of most people. And it's pretty closely related to the religious kind of soul too. So that was the point of departure, finding out exactly what it is that people believe.
If someone starts the answer about the soul with, well, I think, it's like asking someone, what do you think heaven is? Well, I think heaven is this, and everyone's description is different. If everyone's description of the soul is something different, does this mean we are creating our own soul or images of the soul? Are we fabricating it? Is that sort of a giveaway, or am I making it too simple?
You're not. I mean, to people who study what's called the cognitive science of religion, which is a subfield in cognitive science that started, let's say, around the 1990s, that's the answer. The answer is that these notions of supernatural entities and agents are byproducts of our cognitive system. So they are, in some sense, things that people make up. But importantly, they're constrained. It's not just like anything goes, right? So you're right in pointing out that people might differ in what they take the soul to be. and yet at the same time, there are very, very broad commonalities. Right? So the variation is confined, and you have, like I said, in the research that I did, for example, or in the scientific literature that you read, there are these traits, these features that I mentioned, immaterial, non-physical, psychologically potent, and immortal. That really is or captures the soul that most people believe in.
I have you listed here as cognitive scientist. Your resume was actually much too long for me to read here. I mean, I'd still be giving it.
That's what we do, academics. We have nothing better to do than add lines to our resume.
I know, so just line item, just point after point after accolade after accolade. Can you tell me what a cognitive scientist does and what specifically you teach?
So what a cognitive scientist does is try to understand the nature and functioning of mind in human beings, in non-human animals, and this might sound outrageous to some people, but in machines. So we try to understand thought, thinking processes. Cognitive science is a discipline that emerged, in the middle of the 20th century. And it's very interdisciplinary. You have different disciplines approaching the same questions from different perspectives. So you have philosophy, psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, computer science. So it's all in an effort to try to understand how intelligence and thought and minds function.
That brings me to a great point. We have to, of course, draw a circle around the brain and the mind.
Yes.
And this is a conversation that's been going on for a long time. Are you a
Yes.
dualist? Do you believe the brain and the mind are the same?
Right. So in fact, the overwhelming majority of people in my line of work are what's called materialists or physicalists. In other words, we believe that the mind is simply a way to talk about the brain or the body and the brain at some level of abstraction. So in other words, it's not separate. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So it's a famous case that goes back to the middle of the 20th century by Gilbert Ryle. So he gives the example of someone who visits a university. So it's a foreigner who comes to Cambridge or Oxford, and he's walked around and he sees the gym, and he sees the physics department, and he sees the some administrative office, and then he sees the student union. And after all that, he's like, okay, but where's the university? Well, the error he makes is he thinks that the university is a particular building, whereas in fact the university is a way to talk about a collection of buildings, but it's not a building itself. So by analogy, when we talk about the mind, what we really mean is the brain, but we're looking at the brain at a higher level of abstraction. Now, this is an academic point, probably to your audience, but it's a very important one. So I'll give you another analogy to explain why this is so important. So suppose that we're playing chess, you and I, right? We say, okay, let's try to understand what's going on. Why are we moving the way we are? Why are we doing that? Well, suppose now we have a physicist who says, well, look, you have a chess set here. It's a material thing. It's ultimately made out of atoms and fundamental particles. And we have a really, really good theory that accounts for the behavior of the elementary particles, the standard model. So let's try to understand why, Seth, you move your queen this way in terms of, say, quantum field theory. Now, nobody in their right mind would do that because however powerful quantum field theory is, it's not the right level of analysis. In fact, it doesn't even contain the notions and the vocabulary that we need. So notions like, say, pawn or queen or castle don't exist. You're not going to see physicists talk about this in their equations. They're higher level notions. And yet they're crucial to explaining how we play chess, right? We would say, look, Seth did this because Julien threatened his queen with his bishop, and that's why he did that, right? So even though the chess set and the chess game ultimately reduces to elementary particles, to explain what's going on, we sometimes have to work at different levels of abstraction. And we have to postulate entities and relationships that are higher than the level of fundamental particles. So in the case of the brain and the mind, you can be a neuroscientist and you can look at the way various pathways interact and various chemicals and hormones interact. But if you want to talk about certain capacities that we have, say like language or reasoning or whatever, you need to do what we do with chess. You need to invoke higher level concepts and talk about relationships between them. So that's what we mean by mind. We really mean the brain at a certain level of abstraction. It's a tricky concept, but it's a pretty straightforward view that we all have in the cognitive sciences. So it sort of removes the mystery. It's a bit like, let's say, so take your nationality, for example. I'm assuming you're an American, right? Okay, so your nationality is, you can't really, it's sort of an abstraction, right? Your passport is something that's physical and concrete, just like the body and the brain, right? But your nationality is an abstract property of you that can help us explain certain things. It would help us, your nationality would help us explain why you are allowed to do this and not that and what have you. So the mind is to the brain what nationality is to your passport. It's different ways to talk about the same thing at different levels of abstraction.
So are there cognitive scientists who are not, how do you say it? Is it monist, a person who believes the mind and the brain are one? Are they dualists who believe that the mind and the brain are separate? Very,
very, very few. I mean, you can count them on the finger of probably one or two hands.
Well, this is probably an unfair question. I mean, you'd have to quantify the data, but is it a religious thing among many of these people, do you think? They start with a religious idea and then move in? Or?
I have a colleague who's a good friend who's in the linguistics department, who's unusually religious for a scientist, and he's a dualist. So in this case, yes, he's religious. I don't know about all the others, but if I were to do a survey in my own department, I would say that zero. I mean, none of them are dualists.
Does this get us into free will, or our lack of free will, right? If my mind is a mechanism, if it is an organ, it's a computer, for lack of a better word. It's perceiving my environment at the same time it is reacting to and acting in my environment. Do I really have free will? That's a whole other show. I don't mean to sort of go down the rabbit hole, but what are your thoughts?
We could definitely go as deep down in the rabbit hole as you'd like. Well, I think the answer is, I'm sure you've heard this many times from other people you've talked to. It depends what one means by free will. So as with many things, it's you first have to set the semantics, and then you can sort of talk about what the implications are. But if by free will you or anybody means the sort of traditional notion that sometimes that's called libertarian free will or contra-causal free will, what this means essentially is that we are uncaused causes, right? So if you ask someone who believes in contra-causal free will or libertarian free will, well, what causes your thoughts or actions? They will tell you, my will does. And then you say, what causes your will? And they would answer, nothing. It's uncaused. It's free. And that also goes along with a narrative that you hear in many religions of, well, God gave us free will, and so, well, that kind of free will is dead scientifically. Virtually nobody in the sciences believes in that because it's falsified by so many empirical lines of work. It's makes no sense theoretically. So in that sense, we don't have free will. But I think it's not a bad thing. So there's a great little book by Daniel Dennett called Elbow Room. And I think the subtitle is Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting, in which he says, look, libertarian free will, it doesn't make much sense, and it's a good thing. So let me give an example for why it is a good thing. So suppose you and I are not Skyping, but we're at your place or my place, chatting about free will or religion over, say, a martini, right? I fix you a very nice martini. Let's say you like martinis. I don't know if you do, with olives and all that stuff. And we're chatting. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I throw my martini in your face. Now, the first thing I hope you would ask is, why the hell did you do that, right? And you would look for a cause, a reason. You'd say, well, is it something I said? Is he crazy, or like what's going on? Now, suppose that I were to tell you, look, Seth, what I did has nothing to do with what you said, what I believe. It's not caused by anything. It's an act of free will. Well, then what you would conclude is not that I'm free, but that I'm insane. So yeah, you would conclude that I'm insane, not free. You want people's thoughts and reactions and beliefs to be caused. When you get behind the wheel, you're driving your car, there are other drivers on the road, and you want their thoughts and beliefs and actions to be caused, in this case, by a desire to live another day, to get back home safely. So I don't think it's a bad thing to not have that kind of free will. I think what we have is flexible will, to maybe use a term that hasn't been used before. So our will is flexible in the sense that we have a faculty of reason, and we can think about, we can mentally time travel, we can think about the past and the future, we can think about the consequences of our actions and adapt our behavior accordingly. We can take other people's perspectives, we can regard them as moral agents. So there are a lot of things we can do. So it's flexible in that sense. It's not free in the sense that it escapes the laws of physics. It doesn't.
Aren't we still operating, though, as if we have free will? I mean, even if we are acting and reacting as products of our brain, aren't we still? I mean, we're still acting as if we have free will. So
that's a very good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. We are. So for all, the difference is slim. So for all practical purposes, or for most practical purposes, okay, we can act as though we have that kind of free will, right? There are cases where it might not be the right way to think. So these are legal cases. This is when you have to decide how to punish someone. There, we can go down that path if you'd like, but it makes a difference. So I guess an analogy would be, since we're talking about science in general, the difference between, say, classical mechanics, like Newtonian mechanics, versus either general relativity or quantum physics. Newtonian mechanics remains valid. It makes valid predictions in the regime of everyday life. It's enough to put a man on the moon. So we don't have to appeal to relativity or quantum physics for most things. But there are contexts in which we do, because the theory makes the wrong prediction. So if you have a GPS, for example, on your phone or in your car, it's operated and governed by a bunch of satellites in orbit. Well, every now and then, people have to feed in new time coordinates because of the effect of relativity, right? So you have to take relativity into account in that context, but it's a very narrow context, right? And if you didn't take that into account, then you drive into walls and rivers. So I think for free will, I think it's the same thing. For most everyday purposes, it's perfectly fine to assume that we have that kind of free will. But in special contexts, we have to think a little more carefully because the consequences can be pretty drastic if we don't. And then we have to adopt a less intuitive and more sort of analytical and scientific approach to free will.
I can see a portion of my audience is riveted, leaning toward the computer. They're fascinated, hanging on every syllable. And there's a fraction or portion of the audience that's glazed over, going, what the hell are you people doing and talking about? So there is no easy way to get into free will. I mean, we could be here all week. I was at a debate, it was a couple of years ago, it was the philosophers speaking to the harder scientists about free will. And at one point, one of the scientists literally climbed up on the table. He was pounding his fist on the table. I think it was Lawrence Krauss. I mean, they were just going at it, having at it, free will, whatever. I'm not going to take that bunny trail any further. Okay, let's come back to the soul.
Sure.
Talking here with Dr. Julien Musolino, who, by the way, has one of the best names. You sound like an artist or a Bond villain. I can't decide which. It's awesome. So I don't mean to drag you into a family debate, but I am married to a lovely woman who believes in the soul. We were having a conversation last night. And she's like, well, what's your interview about tomorrow? And I gave her the sort of Cliff's Notes version, and we were talking about the soul, and as usual, we disagreed on the issue. And so anyway, you're not going to be responsible for any counseling or anything that we end up in after we have the next part of the discussion, but she's She believes that, there is a force which, the matter cannot be created or destroyed. There is energy within the brain. There is a force that uses the brain as kind of a conduit. She believes in the soul in that context. And so here we are again trying to define the soul. What is it?
Right.
How do you approach that kind of thing? There's an energy in the brain which sort of fuels it. What about those who say that comes from elsewhere?
Well, okay. So first, people who think that and say that are in good historical company, in the sense that this is something often called vitalism, the idea that there's some kind of life force or energy that makes us alive or even give us our thoughts. In fact, if you go back in time a few thousand years ago, you'll find that there was not just one soul at the very beginning. There were different kinds of souls. There were free souls and body souls and life souls and ego souls and surviving souls. And so souls initially were attempts on the part of our pre-scientific ancestors to make sense of biological and psychological phenomena. I mean, let's take us back a few thousand years. Let's say you're Aristotle or Plato, and you're trying to understand, as they were, the difference between something that's perceived by us to be alive and something that's not. So like, say, a rock and a cat. Well, they do very different things, right? Rocks just don't do anything; they just sit there. Cats like jump and purr and feed and breed and all that stuff. So the question these guys were asking back then is, what's the difference? And of course, this was way before science, so they had no idea. The answer that they gave was, so Aristotle, for example, wrote a treatise called literally On the Soul, De Anima, in which he said, look, what distinguishes what's alive from what's not is the presence of souls. And he had a whole hierarchy of souls. He had souls for plants, he had souls for animals, and then he had souls for people, rational souls, sensitive souls, nutritive souls. So what your wife and other people are talking about are really old ideas. They've been around for a while. Things started to change, though, around the time of the scientific revolution with Descartes and a bunch of other people. So to make a long story short, virtually nobody in the sciences believes in that life force or those energies anymore. I think I'll give you an analogy, I think, because you asked me how do you answer this. Life, the way scientists think of life is life is not a substance or a thing, it's a process. Okay, so just imagine a candle burning. Combustion is a process. Once you put out the flame, you interrupt the process. That's it. There's no flame or energy that goes somewhere and continues to live somewhere else. That's the end. So that's, I think, the answer to this. Now, is there energy in us? Of course, there's of course, but it's energy that is understood in physical terms by physical processes. So if you go up a few floors, you have potential energy. There's all kinds of things, but it's not some weird life energy. It's not the way scientists understand life these days, or mind for that matter.
I produced a video a few years ago called Afterlife, which was drawing a circle around the importance of living this life because we have no evidence for a life beyond. And Matt Dillahunty had said something, he'd phrased it in a way that, the electrical impulses in my brain, when I die, that ends. Like all those impulses, all those synapses firing, all that, whatever the terminology is, that ends at death. Meaning that essentially my computer is just off. I mean, do you have a better way of explaining what happens to the mind or the brain at death?
No, it's pretty much what we think happens. I mean, if, as there is a lot of evidence, if thoughts and our mental experiences and consciousness is a product of the operation of the brain and the body, once the body ceases to function, that basically stops. Just like you gave a good analogy, the computer. When you're playing a video game on your computer and you have little characters and little cars, floating around, when you turn off the computer, they don't continue to exist in some, they're not there anymore. Another analogy is if you think of a music box. right? So it's a physical. I mean, we don't have those anymore, but for those who are old enough to know what they are, you crank out the little thing and you hear music. Well, if you ask where does the music come from, the answer is it comes from the operation of the physical parts and the way they're arranged. Right? Now, if you take a baseball bat to it and you smash it to pieces, that's it. You're not going to play music anymore.
Yeah, but the question then becomes, who's turning the crank on the music box, right? I mean, the intent or agency, making the argument here, comes from somewhere. Like, what drives the energies in my body? Why are they in place, and why do they motivate me in that way? It's a very easy leap for a great many people into the spiritual. There's something else that's driving the vehicle.
Of course, because it's massively intuitive. The problem with science is that it's hard and non-intuitive. What I mean by this is that by intuitive, I mean like it's commonsensical to us, right? So the idea of evolution, for example, the fact that if you take enough time, you're going to move from very simple organisms to human beings, or even more other animals. It's hard to fathom. We don't function that way. Or if you talk to people who do physics, and they'll tell you things like, gravity is curved space-time. This makes zero intuitive sense. We don't even know what that means. You have to look at the equations and everything. So all the branches of science that have made some amount of progress, sometimes significant progress, what we see historically is that they've departed from more intuitive ideas. That if you look at the history of science, in almost any field, the early ideas were very intuitive ideas. So mind-body dualism, it turns out, of the Cartesian variety, that's the way most people intuitively think, precisely for the reasons you mentioned. It feels to me, introspectively, that I'm not some physical thing. It feels like there's something maybe behind my eyes that's incontrollable, that is intentional, that's a self, that's an I, that's a soul maybe. That's the way it feels. It's very powerful. And so it takes a lot of reading and thinking to actually say, no, that's not the way it works. That's the trick. The trick is that it's hard. And it's hard to convince people of something that's counterintuitive.
If it doesn't fit on a Facebook meme, I'm just not interested. If I can't read it in the first paragraph of an article, just forget it. That's how I feel about the culture we live in, and I'm guilty of it sometimes in my own life. Right? We like it simple. We like it cut and dry, black and white. We like it to have hard edges on it and to be digestible. Yeah. And I think human beings, almost as a rule, can be this way. Right? We're all guilty.
Yeah, that's true. And our culture, as you say, is not helping.
Yeah.
If you look at the way science is portrayed in our culture, it's just it's terrible. I mean, there are great people doing great work, but there's also a lot of things that are much more dubious in terms of.
Could I talk about like the flat earther? I mean, I can't believe there's a flat Earth movement here in the 21st century. We've spoken about them a few times. But it's intuitive for them to look at the horizon from their own eye line and say that the Earth is flat. But it's the actual measuring, the actual observation and measuring of the planet in a more scientific way that gives you a non-intuitive answer about the shape of the planet. Would that be a good analogy or bad?
It's a perfect analogy. That's exactly right. So, in fact, if you look at what the ancient Greeks believed, I mean, the idea that the Earth is in motion around the sun is not, it's okay, Copernicus and those people, but it goes much further back. So the ancient Greeks, some of them had this idea, but they rejected it. And the reason they rejected it is because it didn't agree with common sense. This was before science, but so they let their intuitions, if you and I are standing where we are, it doesn't feel like the Earth is moving around the sun at 67,000 miles per hour. And so, okay, the Greeks said, forget about it. It can't be true. What we've learned through science is that what's true and what feels true are very different things. And sadly, you can make people in America or elsewhere believe almost anything for a number of reasons. But you can make them believe that we didn't land on the moon, or that the Earth is flat, or that vaccines cause autism, or that Donald Trump is there to help the little guy. Anything you want, you can. Sadly, that's.
We want to believe, right? We want to believe.
We want to believe, and go ahead. I'll let you.
No. I mean, I'm just sort of. I think about all the bad ideas I've embraced in my own life. It's you look back and you think I should have seen it, I should have known better. But I think I did a speech a few years ago called "The Mother of Bad Ideas," where I had fallen in love with the idea of something before I realized or understood the fact of something. Yeah. And we see this about many of our heroes. We see it about specific religious beliefs. We'll fall in love with the idea of Jesus Christ. But do we have any idea where Jesus came from, who first wrote about Jesus Christ, what incarnations of Jesus? We don't know anything really about Jesus, but we fell in love with the idea. And I think that's where I was going. Yeah,
no, your personal story is extraordinary and very telling in that respect. And it's amazing that you were able to change your mind in the way that you did. And now that you are an advocate for...
I'm just angry. I'm just in sin and angry. I'm going. That's what I hear. I'm going through a crisis. I'm going through a phase. And I'm angry.
That's what you're hearing from the folks. That's still. Yeah. Well, I can imagine. Yeah. But these forces, are beginning to be understood by people who do what I do. I mean, they don't do exactly the same kind of research, but there's really good work, for example, on. In fact, so you asked me what I'm teaching. So one of the courses I teach is human cognition, and what I'm going to do this semester in the fall, at the end of it, is talk about the implications of what we've learned about how the mind functions for the question of climate change. There's some really good work that's been done recently on the psychological barriers that prevent us as a species from seeing this as some people do see it as a real clear and present danger that's going to be catastrophic down the road if we don't do anything about it. But that's not most people. And there are important lessons to learn from this kind of work. So that's one case. Religion's another case. It's slightly different, of course, with different explanations, but it's fascinating. Yeah.
Talking here with cognitive scientist Dr. Julien Musolino. From the stage, you said something I thought was really good, and I want to explore it.
Sure.
We don't hear it often, but if we had a soul, a supernatural soul, something that existed beyond the physical, it would still manifest physical reactions or properties in our brain and bodies. Mm-hmm. Correct? I mean, we don't normally think about... When the soul is framed, it's this other. But your position is, well, actually, even if we had a soul, we would still see a measurable reaction that could be seen by science. You want to get into that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's one of the central theses of the book, which is that, so once you define the soul in the way that we did earlier in our discussion, which is empirically based on what people believe, not some definition I pick out of thin air. Once you have that, it's not hard to show that the claim is in fact a scientific one, because it amounts to believing or claiming that the mind or consciousness can operate independently from the body, for one thing, because of the immortality business, right? And the second fact that makes it a scientific hypothesis is that people will tell you that their soul does something for them. It gives them psychological power. So that must mean that whatever that immaterial thing is, it must be able to causally interact with ordinary matter. Well, anything that causally interacts with ordinary matter, there are consequences. If that's say physics, experimental physics is in business of determining, right? So that's one part. The other part is this notion of detachability. And so what I said in the talk and what I say in the book is that there could be evidence that the mind can function separately from the body. So say we could talk to the dead, right? We can't. There's no evidence that we can. And theoretically, unless we make advances and download our consciousness into computers, then yeah, we'll be able to talk to the dead. But the way things are today, no, we can't, for both empirical and theoretical reasons. But if we could, it's not hard to imagine doing an experiment. I can design it in my lab with a couple of undergrads where we would receive information from a deceased under controlled experimental conditions. Then we'd have to replicate this. We'd have to have other groups replicate it. But it's a priori completely plausible that the world could work this way. If it did, then we'd say, look, here are the ashes of Aunt Sally in an urn. We can be quite sure the body doesn't function anymore, but we're getting all these messages, and it's clearly controlled. And so, yeah, that could be one line of evidence. When people have what's called near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, they often report a subjective feeling where they see themselves float around the room, and they say, look, I could see and hear everything. In a way that I couldn't with just my body. Well, there are people who have done experiments where they've placed laptop computers on top of closets displaying certain strings of symbols or numbers. Now, suppose that so the computers were placed in such a way that the physical person on the bed could not possibly, with their eyes, plus they were unconscious anyway, could not see what was on the computer. But suppose that upon regaining consciousness, they were able to perfectly faithfully, pun intended, recite what they saw. And suppose this was done under controlled conditions, and suppose this was replicated, then we'd have really good evidence that the mind can function separately from the body. So the idea of a soul defined the way we have, based on what most people believe, is totally a scientific idea for those reasons. I'm not the first one to say that. Perhaps I'm the one who said that the loudest, or I made it very clear in the book. But, Richard Dawkins has said things about God also that are similar, because these entities are supposed to have manifestations in the physical world that are in principle measurable. Well, if that's the case, then that's, fair game for science. But the flip side of that is that science can also, if it's a scientific question, then we know how to answer scientific questions. We know how to address scientific hypotheses, and they can be true or not true. In the case of the soul, I think there are very, very good reasons for it not to be true.
Well, the other challenge, too, probably is that the soul is conveniently unfalsifiable, at least in a certain context. When people are subjectively saying, well, a soul is this, or I think a soul is that, and it operates here, and it does this, and everybody's definition is a little bit different, it's impossible really to pin down. It's a convenient way of making a claim without having to really demonstrate it.
Right. So that's another way to have your cake and eat it, too, if you're a soul believer, is to make the claim so vague that they're devoid of content, and they become unfalsifiable. But in this case, when you ask people what they mean by soul, most of them are very clear. And if you take them at their word, then that's clearly a scientific idea.
If they make a specific claim, then you have hard data that you can then take and test, correct?
Yes, it's all about the nature of the claim, right? Once you agree on what the claim is, then you can check and see whether the claim is in principle something that could be verified scientifically using the usual tools of science. In the case of the soul, the answer is a clear yes. Given the three properties that people believe in, yes, there could be evidence very easily that we have a soul. There isn't. But it's worse than that. It's not just that there isn't evidence, it's that there's a number of lines of reasoning that all converge on the same conclusion. That's what philosophers of science call consilience of evidence. That's what supports strong conclusions like evolution, like climate change, right? So in the case of evolution, you have the fossil record, and you have molecular biology, comparative anatomy. All these things point in the same direction. Likewise for the soul. It all points in the direction that says, look, the soul has exactly the set of properties that it should have if it didn't exist. And that also explains something very nicely, which is why is it that scientists overwhelmingly do not believe in the soul anymore? Well, because they realize it's a scientific claim and there's no evidence for it. And it flies in the face of everything we've discovered about science, and so they see no reason. So of course, this might sound a little abstract to some people, but here's an analogy, right? Suppose that I were to tell you that I have a friend who's a great athlete. He's really a super athlete, and he's very well trained. Normal guy. He's not enhanced in any way. He doesn't have rockets attached to his legs or anything like that. But my claim to you is he can run a marathon under 10 minutes. Okay, so the question is, how plausible would that claim be? Given what we know about the length of a marathon, human locomotion, the answer is, look, it's ludicrous. It can't be true, right? Because we know too much about how fast people can run, and a marathon's 26-something miles. There's no way. Same thing for the soul. Scientists no longer believe in it because it really flies in the face of everything we know about science, pretty much.
As much as I hate to drag you back into my living room for a second time, I'm going to do it. And the other reason I ask this somewhat self-serving question is because I think the listeners and viewers will find it interesting as well. We were having our discussion last night. We were talking about what constitutes me, like what constitutes the self. Mm-hmm. If the brain is what receives stimuli, through the eyes of my sight and my senses and, taste, touch, and smell and all that, but it's received by the brain. My memories are stored in the brain. My brain is then causing me to act and react in specific ways in this world. So am I my brain? And the conversation we had is, let's say they were to perfect, and this is an abstract, perfect the technology to, let's say, transplant my brain, my physical organ, the brain, in someone else's body. Would that person then become me? Perhaps this is more of a philosophical question. I don't know. What's your take? Am I my brain?
Uh-huh. So you raise a very interesting set of questions. And you're right, there are all kinds of thought experiments like that. So you can do what you described, or you can actually imagine that we have a teleportation machine, like in Star Trek, right? So we take you, Seth, right here, we make a copy of you, and we beam it to Mars, and now there are two Seths, one on Earth, one on Mars. Who's the real you? And so on and so forth. So I think there are two things to say about this. The first is that our intuitions about personhood are very shaky, okay? And I don't think we can trust them to tell us something about what's really going on, like our intuitions about many things. And this has been tested in some by psychologists in different experiments. So we have weird intuitions. By the way, there's a great piece on this topic by Daniel Dennett at the end of one of his books. The piece is called "Where Am I?" And it's a reflection on these bizarre scenarios that you can construct that really boggle our intuitions. And we end up saying, look, who knows? I don't know. So I think intuitively, it's very easy to show that our intuitions fall apart very quickly, and we don't know, like, who's the real me and who's not the real me. So that's from the intuitive perspective. From the sort of objective scientific perspective, you are your body and your brain, and that's it. And anything mental is sort of a construction. So the self is an elaborate construction it's a product of organized matter. Do we know exactly how this comes about? No.
But I guess it also comes down to how I define me. How do I define self? But if I'm looking at the accumulation of my thoughts and experiences and memories and all of that, if you were to replicate those elsewhere, it could be argued that that person would also be me. Correct?
That depends on whose perspective. Right? From their perspective, they would say they're themselves. From your perspective, you would say, look, I'm me and they're not me. They're a copy of me, right? What they would say probably is, look, I'm me and you're a copy of me. So
I've seen this movie, Julie. I've seen this movie. I saw Moon. I saw the clones. I know that this is we could be here all day. It's a fascinating thought experiment.
It is. Absolutely. It's
also, if you touch on the teleporter, we get into, I don't know if you're a Trek fan, but we were talking about, and this is a common conversation out there, and I think it's actually been a conversation in my stepdaughter's university class. They were talking about if you were to beam from point A to point B, but they would annihilate the cells in your body at point A to rematerialize them, or replicate them rather, at point B. They have essentially killed you and copied you. Would the person who arrived at point B still be you? And there are whole conversations, long ones, going on out there about this.
And I think those things probably can't be resolved because our intuitions sort of fall apart. There's a great movie, I don't know if you've seen it, called The Prestige.
Yes.
Yeah, same thing. Hugh Jackman, every night when he performs that trick, he creates a copy of himself. The copy, I think, survives, and then the original drops into a container of water and drowns, and then that's it. And it's, so that movie, by the way, is really good and made me really think. It's really, really good. But yes, it just those things I think boggle the mind. But again, I think the general point about this is that so we are the product of evolution, and evolution doesn't care about truth; it cares about fitness. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that our minds and our intuitions do not deliver truth very easily. It actually takes. Think about how long it took for us as a species to develop something like the scientific method to get a handle on what's happening in the world, right? And so,
so you're saying these mechanisms, it's like Shermer's, I forget what he calls the experiment, but it's the guy in the African savannah. There's a rustle in the bushes. Mm-hmm. It's either the wind or it's a predator. Well, I'm going to probably more intuitively guess predator because
right.
That's more key to my own survival, right?
Right.
From an evolutionary benefit, it actually will still benefit me in a way if I'm wrong in that instance. I may be wrong in point of fact, but it's helpful in the long game. I don't know if that's an accurate way to say it or not.
That's right. That's the general idea. So another way to say this is that we as creatures, as animals, evolved in a world that was governed by certain laws of physics at the level at which we function, right? We do not, unless we have advanced equipment, we cannot peer into the macroscopic or think about the things around us. Predators don't move at the speed of light around us. So there's no need for us, from the point of view of evolution, to understand, to have intuitions about the quantum world or the world of relativity or anything like that, right? So we have intuitions that are not even classical. We have intuitions as far as physics, which are really Aristotelian. And it's no surprise if you look at the history of science that it developed the way it did. The early attempts to make sense of how things work were based on the intuitions that we have. And again, evolution doesn't care about us having a true theory of motion or anything like that. It simply, when I say wants, I don't mean to sound teleological, but it simply wants us to have a good enough handle so that we don't fall off cliffs and stuff like that, right? So it gives us very gross approximations of what's going on, but they're useful, right? Most of us don't fall off cliffs and walk into walls, but now the world is complicated. So when we start to look carefully, those useful intuitions that we have very easily fall apart. And it's not the way the world actually works. And that's true for what we just discussed, motion, but also it's true for personhood. So we have these intuitions, okay, that I'm me and I'm a self, but if you start to push people around, it's not clear what they rest on and they fall apart very quickly.
Before I give out I think you have a website. You have a place where people can send the hate mail that they're the people who believe in the soul who are going to come after you. Yeah, we'll do that in just a second. Any final thoughts on the soul as we come to a close here? Any sort of punctuation mark on this conversation you'd like to add?
I would say, I think what I say in the book, that we almost certainly don't have a soul, but there's nothing to worry about. It doesn't detract from our beauty. It doesn't detract from meaning. In fact, it's probably a better thing. And I developed this in the book. I try to show that we're probably better off as a society, as a species, if we do not hold to the... I'm not saying, by the way, that these beliefs can't be helpful to particular individuals, right? So there's something that Noam Chomsky, the linguist and intellectual, said once that really touched me. He was asked by Lawrence Krauss, who is not a friend of religion, to put it mildly. He was asked, well, what should we do if there are all these people who believe this and that? Should we correct them and everything? And so Chomsky, always the thoughtful person, said, look, if people believe that to take an example, we talked about the Earth is flat, then yes, you try to correct that. But if you meet a mother of a child from a low socioeconomic background who just lost her boy and who finds comfort and solace in the idea that they'll be reunited in heaven, Chomsky said, I would not have the arrogance to give her a lesson in epistemology. So I think that's a good approach. I mean, if there are people for whom these ideas, I lost a brother many years ago. I wish I believed in the soul, and I wish it helped me. I didn't, and that's fine. But if it helps some people, great. The trick is that these ideas often do not remain personal. They're sort of broadcast in society, and policies are based on them, and ideas are based on them that do not just apply to the poor person who lost a child or a brother. And that's where we get in trouble, I think.
Dr. Julien Musolino, he's author of the book, The Soul Fallacy, which I will link in the description box of both the video and the radio podcast version of this broadcast. I really do appreciate you taking the time to sort of educate us and take us down this path. It's just sort of a starting point for a great many of us, but we really do appreciate it, and thanks for your great work out there, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a great day, Seth.